Crusades were barbaric invasions for land, loot, and converts. That the Inquisition was an orgy of torture and public execution of heretics. That the Catholic Church supported slavery. The persecution of Galileo proves that the Church is anti-science. And finally, the Pope Pius XII was an anti-Semitic Nazi sympathizer. So lots of good, juicy stuff in there. There's probably more that we could do, and who knows, maybe that'll be Mythbusters Part 2 next year or something, but these are the myths that we're going to tackle this evening. So the first one is the Crusades, okay? Anyone, just your general impression, what you have heard people say about the Crusades? Anyone? Yeah.
Primarily religious war.
Religious war.
That we killed a lot of innocent people.
Killed a lot of innocent people.
The pilgrims were being killed and robbed.
That the pilgrims to the Holy Land were being killed and robbed.
What was an effort to protect and preserve the holy sites in Jerusalem and the surrounding area.
Right, effort to protect the Holy Land. Okay. Yes? Christians against Muslims, basically, yes. Okay, so all of those things, those are all part of the story of the Crusades. Recently, I think it was a year or two ago, President Obama at the National Prayer Breakfast caused a stir because he compared current Islamic terrorism to Christian involvement in the Crusades, and saying that no religion is perfectly clean and all of that. So, and it comes up a lot, especially today in relation to terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism. The idea that Crusades come up. So, some different Crusade myths that are out there, that they were unprovoked attack on a peaceful Muslim world, that the Crusaders invaded the Holy Land to get rich, they barbarically raped and murdered women and children, and the Crusades are responsible for Muslim extremism and terrorism today. So that's some of the things we're going to kind of break down a little bit. Ah. Okay. Still clicking while I'm going. Okay, so build up to the Crusades. If you're a history buff, you'll like this. I'm a history buff, so I kind of like getting into this. But so basically, from the 1st through the 7th century, to the mid-600s, Christianity became the prominent faith of the Roman Empire. Constantine in the 4th century basically made Christianity legal, and eventually would go on to become the official state religion. And the Roman Empire encompassed most of the known Western world at the time. So it went from the Middle East across northern Africa all the way up into Europe and England. That was the range of the Roman Empire at the time. And for the most part, by the 7th century, that was all Christian kingdoms and lands and so forth and so on. Christianity was the prominent faith in those areas. In 612, Muhammad started Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. So according to the Islamic tradition, he's visited by the angel Gabriel, and he dictates the Quran and starts the Islamic faith. Muhammad died in 632, and in the 100 years after he died, by 732, Islam had replaced Christianity as the predominant religion in the Middle East and North Africa. So in 100 years, it took over what Christianity, it took Christianity almost 500 years to do. And it spread mostly through military conquest at the point of the sword. So this little map kind of gives you a breakdown. So this is current day Saudi Arabia, and this area down in here, in this color, this is where Islam was when Muhammad died. And by 750, Islam had crossed northern Africa up into Spain. Almost all of Spain was under Islamic rule. It had made inroads into Asia Minor, today modern Turkey, out into Persia, and was knocking on the door of Europe. So a little bit of a timeline to get us up to when the Crusades happened. By 714, most of Spain was under Muslim rule. Those were the Moorish Muslims. And today, if you go to Spain, you can still see their influence in a lot of architecture and things like that. In 732, Muslim army was defeated as they were trying to cross into modern-day France, the kingdom of the Franks. Between 831 and 1072, Muslims controlled Sicily and sections of southern Italy. In 846, Muslim armies sacked Rome. At the time that happened, the political leadership of that part of the empire had already relocated, so it was more of a symbolic sacking, but it was still a blow to Christian Europe, more or less, or to the Roman Empire at that time, that Muslims had come in. In the year 1009, the Caliph of Egypt issued a decree to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So that's the church that was built over the site of the crucifixion and the tomb of Christ's resurrection. And so in 1009, the Caliph of Egypt issued a decree that church should be destroyed. He was deposed not long after that. One of the myths that doesn't necessarily pertain to this is that there was a single Muslim culture of the time, or single Muslim empire, but really it was a battle even within Muslim states between different Muslim leaders, and the power, the central power shifted from Egypt into Persia, into Turkey. So there were different warring Muslim factions as well. Just like we would see in Europe with different warring Christian kingdoms as well. So it wasn't a monolithic culture during this whole time. There were the power struggles on that end too. So he was opposed, and in 1038, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt. There was a relative peace where Muslims were allowing Christian pilgrims from Europe to come and visit the Holy Lands. That changed in 1055 when the Seljuk Turks became the prominent Islamic or Muslim power. And really they came in and took over the Middle East from this Egyptian center of power. Really weren't all that up on any kind of treaties or things that the Egyptians had worked out with Europe, with the European powers. So the Seljuk Turks become rulers. They start to advance on Constantinople, which was the head of the Byzantine Empire at the time, of the Eastern Roman Empire. And between 1070 and 1095, we see a period of European Christian pilgrims going to visit the Holy Land and suffering attacks and kidnappings and ransoms and persecution. And so really it came to a head in the year 1095, and that's when the First Crusade was called. It was called by Pope Urban II, and the call was to go and liberate the Holy Land from these Muslim powers. And keep in mind, this was Christian territory for centuries before the Muslims came through. So the cry, the emphasis in Europe was, we need to retake the Holy Land that we have lost. And the First Crusade was probably the most successful of all of the Crusades. There were basically 8 major Crusades that happened over a period of several hundred years, but the First Crusade was the most successful. They came down, they retook Jerusalem, they established what were called the Crusader states. These were little mini kingdoms, so to speak, along the Mediterranean coast. And what happened was, once Jerusalem was liberated, once the Holy Land was liberated, most of the Crusade force turned around and left. They went back to Europe. They went back to their homes. Just a relatively small force was left behind. The Second Crusade was in 1146, and this was called to defend Edessa. Edessa was one of those Crusader states that was left over. Well, in that time period, where there's just a small force left behind, the Muslim forces kind of rallied and they wanted to take their land back again. So it was this back and forth between the Crusaders and the Muslims on gaining and losing ground. They wanted to get to Edessa. They never really even made it that far. They were able to liberate Damascus, and that was it. They were stopped, essentially. The Third Crusade was a renewed call to go and free Jerusalem, because by this time Jerusalem had fallen. And so Pope Gregory, this is 1188, it's almost 100 years after the First Crusade. He calls this to go free Jerusalem. This is if you're familiar with Robin Hood and Richard the Lionhearted, okay, this is that time period. This was the crusade that Richard was going on to go and liberate Jerusalem. It was a failed crusade. They did not make it to Jerusalem. They were able again to establish some slivers of land along the coast, but that was about it. The Fourth Crusade is probably the most infamous. It was called for by Innocent III, and by all accounts, it was an unmitigated disaster. This is the one that gets all of the bad rap. Basically, what happened is this Fourth Crusade was called, and by the time these subsequent crusades were being called, fewer and fewer people were leaping at the chance to run off to fight in the Holy Land. The First Crusade had a casualty rate of around 75%. So, and by this time you're at the Fourth Crusade, a lot of these kingdoms, a lot of these families were running out of money to fund these extended campaigns. It wasn't like you could hop on a plane and parachute into the Holy Land. Right? You had to sail across the Mediterranean. You had to trek through a desert or a desertous region. Right? And you're fighting the whole way because you're an invading force, so you have to set up beachheads and things like that. It was not an easy task. The Fourth Crusade, what happened was basically they got together and the Venetians agreed to supply the ships to sail everyone over there. Well, they didn't get the turnout that they thought, and in fact, they got about half of as many people as they had thought that they would get to come for the Crusades, but the Venetians wanted money for the whole fleet because they had put off in their own town, in their own region, resources and time and people. The Crusaders didn't have it. And so what happened was the Venetians said, well, we'll tell you what, let's set sail and we'll raid these little cities along the way. And it's basically the Venetians settling score for different countries, that the Venetians had issues with. Okay, so, and basically what happened was they ran into the son of the deposed emperor of Constantinople, of the Byzantine Empire, and he said, hey, put me back in power in Constantinople and I'll pay for everything. And so they set sail for Constantinople, which was a Christian city. They got there, they kind of encamped against the city, they forced this, the ruler to come to power, the people revolted, he was killed, and they didn't get their money. And so the Christian forces from Europe sacked the Christian city of Constantinople. The entire Fourth Crusade happened, and not one Muslim battle was fought. It was a series of European Christians sacking and attacking Mediterranean, Eastern Byzantine Christian cities. And this is one of the chief reasons that really solidified the split between the East and the West in the church. Orthodox Christians today still hold massive grudges against the Latins for what happened in Constantinople, because they were raping and pillaging and looting and burning and doing all of those things. There was, in the meantime, this thing called the Children's Crusade. This was not called for by the Pope. This was a movement of young people. It's called children, mostly like preteen, teenagers, that set out to conquer the Muslims with love, not arms. They were behind two visionaries, a teenage visionary from France and another from Germany, and they said that they would get to the shore of the Mediterranean and God would open the sea like the Red Sea so they could walk straight to the Holy Land, and the Muslims would just convert, and that would end the Crusades. That didn't happen. What did happen was many died along the way, they never left Europe, but they died just in the travels within Europe of exposure and starvation, and large groups of them were sold in by other European Christians, sold into slavery to Muslims. Again, Middle Ages were not the cleanest of times as far as trying to find good guys and bad guys. The Fifth Crusade, the only notable thing about this was, if you're familiar with the story of St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan, that happened during the Fifth Crusade. So St. Francis of Assisi wanted to be martyred, and the Fifth Crusade was targeting Egypt and North Africa. And so he went over during the crusade, and he and a couple other friars marched off into the Muslim camp to preach the gospel, thinking they would be martyred for the faith. Instead, he hit it off with the Sultan. The Sultan was impressed with his bravery and with his sincerity and his love, and gave Francis free pass to leave without being harmed. And it goes back to this encounter with Francis of Assisi is the reason why the Franciscans are the caretakers of the Holy Land. Because it formed a connection between the Muslims and the Franciscans, that the Muslims trusted the Franciscans because of this encounter with St. Francis and the Sultan, that the Franciscans are the predominant Latin Catholic authority in Jerusalem over the holy sites. The 6th, 7th, and 8th Crusades, these were not done, these weren't called for by the popes, these were just Catholic kings wanting glory and trying to go off, and basically none of them ever really succeeded. So after the First Crusade, it was just a series of one losing battle after another. So to summarize the whole idea of the Crusades, they were primarily defensive battles. That was the motive, was to create a safe journey for Christian pilgrims. Thousands of Europeans were taking pilgrimages to the Holy Land. They were seeking a way to make it safe for them to do that. And really it was a delayed response against a lot of Muslim aggression over several centuries of invasions into Europe and so forth, that the European forces kind of finally rose up. They were ultimately failures. The last of the Crusader states fell in 1291, so less than 200 years. All of the progress was lost. For most, rather than they went to get rich, many went bankrupt. During the Sixth Crusade, Louis of France, to finance the crusade, it cost 6 times the annual income of the entire kingdom just to go on the crusade. Many went bankrupt. Others, they were selling off lands, they were selling off titles, they were selling off castles in Europe to fund this. The Crusader states that were left behind depended on money from Europe being sent to them to even function. They didn't have any resources in the Holy Land for themselves. There may have been a few people here and there that were able to get wealthy, and we know that today. You know, there's always those few that are able to kind of make everything work for them. But the vast majority of people went bankrupt. Again, they had extremely high casualty rates. This was nothing that people went into lightly. If you went on a crusade, you weren't expecting to come back. The main motivation for the Crusades was acts of penance. It was to show how your devotion to God and offer yourself up as a sacrifice, basically, to the Lord. And as far as the warfare, it was savage. Were there massacres? Yes, but what happened in the Crusades is, you know, when Jerusalem initially fell, there was a massacre that took place. But these were the same tactics that all armies of the day used. There was nothing unique about the violence of the Crusades that was different than the violence of this period of time in the Muslim or Christian world. When Muslims sacked a city, they did just the same amount of atrocities that the Christians did. When one Christian kingdom fought another Christian kingdom, when the English fought the French, they were just as brutal to each other as they were to the Muslims. It was just part and parcel of what warfare was like. To our modern sensibilities, it sounds extreme, but if a city didn't surrender right away, and you had to lay siege to it, you had to spend time and money and troops, then you punished that city by sacking it, by destroying it, by murdering people, because you wanted to send a message to the next city, just surrender. It's kind of a shock and awe campaign, medieval style. As far as the connection to today's Islamic extremism, it wasn't until the early 1900s that Muslims even really cared about the Crusades. There weren't any Muslim books written about it. It wasn't really a big part of their history. From their perspective, the Crusades were, these Europeans came and we swatted them away. We won. They didn't care. It wasn't until the 1900s when European Christians and European, well, I don't even say Christians, but Europeans influenced by the Enlightenment set up this idea that this was European colonialism, that these European savages were acting, you know, against this peaceful, advanced Muslim culture. And what happened was Arab nationalistic movements were taking root at the time in the Middle East to gain independence from colonialism. So they kind of adopted this view that was from European philosophers and historians to say that the Crusades were such a bad thing to Muslims and we need to rise up against that. So until that time, you'd be hard-pressed to find much writing of any, if anything, in any histories in Muslim cultures about the Crusades other than we defeated these stupid Christians. So, moving right along, the Inquisition. I was going to put a little Mel Brooks History of the World musical number in here about the Inquisition, but so Inquisition myths that the church persecuted simple Bible-believing Christians. They were mock trials denying legal protection. Torture and public executions were rampant. You were assumed guilty until they proved you guilty. And hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, were put to death during this time. all lies. There were three main inquisitions that took place. The first was in southern France, and this was against the Albigensian heretics. This is where St. Dominic and the Dominican order comes from. It was set up to come against these Albigensians. They had a kind of a cross between Gnosticism and Manichaeism, early heresies from the church that basically said the physical world is bad, only the spiritual world is good. And so the first crusade was set up in southern France to put an end to that, to the heresy there. The Spanish Inquisition, which is the most famous, that's the one we'll look at tonight. And then the Roman Inquisition, started in 1542, technically is still around today. It became known as the Holy Office, and then the Holy Office became known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is still around today. But as far as inquisitional practices, they ended. I think the last real action, inquisitional hearing as part of the Roman Inquisition was in the 1800s. And that was, by that time, it was really more legal courtroom type stuff. So why were there inquisitions to begin with? The purpose was to establish a legal means of examining and stopping the spread of heresy. The church, remember, took very seriously salvation. It was a life and death matter. If you fell away from the faith and died, you were going to hell. And so for the church, any means in this world to stop people from going to hell was worth the effort. Because we're talking about eternal consequences, not just worried about temporal consequences. And they always sought repentance and conversion as their primary goal. The root of the Inquisitions comes, scripturally, you can find it in Deuteronomy. It says, if there is found among you in one of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, and transgresses his covenant by going to serve other gods and worshiping them. And if it is reported to you or you hear of it, and you make a thorough inquiry, and the charge is proved true that such an abhorrent thing has occurred in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has committed the crime, and you shall stone that man or woman to death. So what's funny is, it's a lot of times, especially with the Inquisitions, you get Protestant anti-Catholic accusations against the church for its authoritarianism, but the church was working out of a reading of Scripture saying, if you fear these things, inquire into them, find out what's going on. So the Spanish Inquisition, just a little bit of background, kind of the ugly truth is the Spanish Inquisition was aimed primarily at descendants of Jewish converts. For those who say the Inquisitions were anti-Semitic, there was a shred of truth to that. What happened was, in the late 14th century, so the 1300s, Spain was home to the largest concentration of Jews in Europe. And apart from any involvement of the church, there just rose up anti-Semitic riots and unrest. And what happened was many Jews fled or they converted to get away from the harassment, the riots, the persecution. It wasn't church initiated. This was just on a civil level, societal, that this was happening. And these converts were known as conversos. Eventually, those converso families fully integrated into the Spanish Catholic life. Okay? So maybe initially there was a lot of conversions out of coercion or wanting to avoid persecution, maybe insincere conversions, we would think. But over time, as those families moved along in the faith and one generation came up after another, you were seeing conversos that became priests, that were becoming bishops. And so it wasn't like it was purely fake. It became an authentic conversion for those families, or at least their descendants. What happened was many of the old Christian families in Spain started getting jealous of these conversos because, well, why has he become a bishop? His family just converted to the faith 2 generations ago. My family's been faithful for 40 generations, whatever it happens to be. So, and so what happened again, a wave of anti-Semitism started spreading around, and only this time it wasn't necessarily targeted at Jews, it was targeted at these converso families, the families of descendants of Jews that converted, saying they weren't really Catholic, that they were secretly practicing their Jewish faith, and they were just Catholic on the outside just for the benefits of it. And so King Frederick asked the Pope for an inquisition to root out all these fake Catholics. It wasn't looking for Jews, it was looking for supposedly people who claimed to be Catholic, but only in name, and they were secretly practicing either their Jewish faith or their Muslim faith. And so they got permission in 1482 to do that. So executions, everyone thinks of the Inquisitions, you think of 2 things, torture and execution. So just kind of a look at what happened. For the first 50 years of the Spanish Inquisition, records are kind of spotty. They weren't kept as well. But most experts today, most historians will say, in those first 50 years, probably around 1,500 people were executed. Whether it was burned at the stake, hung, what have you. However, from 1540 onward to about 1700, we have detailed records from the Inquisition. There were 44,674 cases tried before the Spanish Inquisition during that time. So, considering that that's a span of almost 200 years, the thought process that many people have in the Inquisition was this rampant, all over the place thing. At least in the Spanish Inquisition, that really wasn't the case. There were only 826 executions during those 200 years. And most of the people that were executed, we could see from the records, were repeat offenders. They were being brought up on charges for their 4th, 5th, 6th time before the inquisitors. Now, does that excuse those executions? We look back on it now, and again, from our perspective, in our culture, we say it's a horrible thing. But when we think about it again, with a medieval mindset of, we need to stop people from perverting the faith and taking people to hell, this was the motivation behind it. So the total estimated executions during the Spanish Inquisition was about 1,700, which was fewer than 10 executions a year over those 200 years that it lasted. Again, not what our modern understanding of, the popular understanding of the Inquisition was. To put that in perspective, Henry VIII in England, in 37 years, executed 60,000 people. Many of them Catholics after his break from Rome. So, for all of the beef that people have with the Spanish Inquisition and the association with it burning people at the stake and all of this stuff, in reality and within the historical context of the time, very few people were put to death during the Inquisition. When you look at Henry VIII, when you look at the different wars that were going on between Catholics and Protestants, and the various persecutions of one group and another, different Protestant groups were persecuting each other, Catholics and Protestants were persecuting each other. There's a lot of people being burned at the stake and whatnot in Europe at this time, but not so much when it comes to the Spanish Inquisition. Torture. So we have to understand all medieval courts at the time employed some form of torture, right? Enhanced interrogation techniques. That was common practice, and it was common practice dating back to the Roman courts. And so we look at it and say, oh, what barbarians, but they didn't, that's the way things were. That there were different methods of extracting confessions and extracting information. The Inquisition, however, was bound by church law, and the church actually set up rules for enhanced interrogation, torture. A person can only be tortured once. They can only have one session where these methods were used, and it can last for no longer than 15 minutes. There could be no damage to life or limb, and there could be no shedding of blood. Now, it still leaves a lot that you can do, but there were definite guidelines that the church had in place for its ecclesial courts that were different than the secular courts of the day. The records we have from those 44,000 cases show that only 2% of the cases used torture. Anytime these techniques were used, a clerk had to be present, and he kept a record of what was done, and then that record was entered into that person's record, file, whatever you want to call it. So of those 44,000 cases, only 2% involved the use of these enhanced techniques, shall we say. Now what's funny is we can look in Spanish civil records from the time and see that prisoners or the accused on trial in Spanish civil courts during their trial would commit acts of blasphemy in hopes that their case would be transferred from the civilian authorities to the Inquisition, because they knew that the Inquisition was governed by church law and not civil law. They wanted to get into the Inquisition court and not be in the civil court. So who was targeted? Going back to that database that we have of those 44,000 cases, 52% were the people accused of being crypto-Jews or the hidden Jews, Catholics who were just Catholic in name only and practicing Judaism. 29% were Muslim in that same, they were Muslim converts to Christianity, converts to Catholicism, that people said you're not really a true believer, you're practicing Muslim faith behind the scenes. The rest, 8% were Protestants. The Protestant Reformation really never took root in Spain for various reasons. Just culturally, it was a different kind of thing. 6% of the cases before the Inquisition involved bigamy. Okay. So these were marriage cases of having more than one wife, and generally the result of that was making them divorce the second or third wife and stick with the first one. 3% were cases of priests who were accused of violating celibacy. And then 1% each were cases of, again, tying in sexual offenses of sodomy or bestiality. So that's what the Inquisition went after. It wasn't this persecution of Protestants. It wasn't this persecution of Bible-believing Catholics. And the Spanish Inquisition wasn't even looking at heresy per se. It was looking at people who were trying to pass themselves off as Catholics that really weren't, and were getting the benefits of society at the time. Two things that kind of stand out. If you were accused of homosexuality during the Spanish Inquisition, the directive was to leave them alone. Right? They weren't subject to the Inquisition unless they were accused of heresy. And in that case, it wasn't the act of sodomy, but it was trying to say that sodomy was okay in the eyes of God. It was trying to rationalize say that the Bible was okay with it. So it was the heresy, not the actual homosexuality. So when, again, today we'll hear people, they'll bring up the Inquisition or something like that in terms of the church's anti-homosexuals or God's anti-gay or whatever it happens to be. we go back to the Middle Ages where you would think it would be even more dramatic than it is today. And they were not part of the focus of the Inquisition. The other thing is, people think of witch trials, witch hunts going on during this time. That was predominantly a Protestant phenomenon. The Inquisition, particularly the Spanish Inquisition, did what it could to suppress witch hunts and witch trials. They recognized that most accusations of witchcraft were basically superstitious behavior. It was someone seeking a healing or seeking a favor, and half the time not knowing what was going on. You look in the records, most of the times there was witchcraft, an accusation of witchcraft. There was also a large consumption of alcohol involved. And so they weren't concerned with it. Between 1540 and 1640, in 200 years, the Spanish Inquisition only put to death 12 people accused of sorcery or witchcraft. And all of those were, again, multiple repeat offenders. And what's interesting is in Barcelona, there was an outbreak of a witch trial where several women were accused of being witches, and the Inquisition sent investigators who found that no, they were innocent, that ordered that their property be restored to them, and then put on trial those who were conducting the witch hunt. So just a little interesting little tidbit. The Inquisition, it was, again, these aren't happy moments in church history, but they're definitely not as bad as I think a lot of the negative myths that we see when we start to dig into it. So slavery. Slavery meant that the Catholic Church taught that slavery was immorally acceptable. It was supportive of slavery in the New World, or at least at a minimum, it failed to condemn slavery and therefore consented by silence. So there's two rounds of slavery to talk about. So round one, all classical societies were slave societies. The Romans, the Greeks, the early Europeans, the Franks, the Goths, all of these groups practiced some form of slavery, usually by the people you conquered, you made your slaves. The first time slavery was abolished was by the Catholic Church during the so-called Dark Ages. And they did that primarily by allowing sacraments for the slaves. They recognized that slaves should be baptized, that they had access to the sacraments, and establishing that they were then Christians. And then it was, how can one Christian own another Christian? So it's kind of a subversive way of looking at it. They encouraged slave owners to free their slaves for the sake of the slave owner's soul. That this would make you a better person, that this would purify your faith. And then through mixed marriages. Mixed marriages were, well, technically illegal. A lot of times they happened. Usually it was between an owner and a slave. The most famous case was King Clovis of the Franks, Clovis II, married a slave of his named Bathilda. Clovis died. Bathilda came as his spouse rose to prominence and basically ran the Franks until Clovis' son was old enough to take over. She abolished slavery within the kingdom of the Franks. The church recognizes her as a saint. She was canonized, Saint Bathilda, for her work in ending slavery. Charlemagne, king of the Holy Roman Empire, along with Saint Wulfstan and Saint Anselm, worked it so that by the end of the 9th century, slavery in Christian-controlled areas of Europe, of the world, was abolished. And St. Thomas Aquinas, in his writings, and he was in the 13th century, taught that and wrote that slavery violates the natural law, that it's intrinsically evil, there's no excuse for it, it can never be condoned. And he was still is, preeminent Catholic theologian. So round two, what happened? We found the New World. And so European exploration reignited slave trade. The argument by those in the new slave trade now was that these new people we're finding, whether they were Africans or Indians of the New World, that they weren't fully human. Right? And so that got them out of the you can't own a human as oh well they're not truly human. And embarrassingly, there were some popes that didn't always live up to the church's teaching on things like this. Innocent IV accepted several hundred Moorish Muslim slaves that were offered to him and had them in the Vatican. Of course, Innocent also fathered children out of wedlock. He was a drunkard, and all kinds of other things. So we can have another night on bad popes. The thing is, you could have a bad pope. He never taught that it was okay. So Eugene IV in the 1430s, as this new world slave trade was starting to take off, issued a papal bull, a papal document that said that involvement in the slave trade carried with it the punishment of excommunication. If you were involved in the slave trade, you were excommunicated from the church. Pius II, Sixtus IV, reaffirmed that. They followed Eugene. Paul III in the 1530s issued 2 documents on slavery. He said that the root of slavery comes from Satan, and he also issued in his bull, in his papal document, that natives or Indians are fully man. This is in 1500s, saying your argument that these indigenous people that you're coming upon aren't fully human, no, they're fully man. And then Urban VIII, again, reaffirmed excommunication as a penalty for slave trade. The reason why there's so many popes on here doing this is because, unfortunately, all this was happening at a time in history when papal power was at its low point. They just ignored what the Pope said, particularly the Spanish. In fact, Spanish forces had sacked Rome in 1527. That's when you had the Holy Roman Empire going on, and you had these various European kingdoms. Well, the Spaniards invaded and sacked Rome. The Pope had fled. They made it illegal to publish papal decrees in Spain and in Spanish-controlled colonies. So all of the documents any Pope would come up with, none of it was ever read to anyone in Spanish-controlled territories. And they were the preeminent power in the world at that time. So what happened was, in the New World, there was a development, particularly in North America, of slave codes. There was the Code Noir from France and the Código Negro Española in Spanish-controlled territories. So even though the French and the Spanish were ignoring the Pope, saying you can't have slaves, they still came up with these codes on how slaves should be treated. These were civil codes that were issued in predominantly Catholic countries governing the slave trade. They held that baptism and religious instructions, that slaves were entitled to baptism and religious instruction, that slaves could receive the sacrament of holy matrimony, and they banned the selling off of individual family members in those territories. Slaves were exempted from work on Sundays and holy days of obligation. However, if a slave chose to work on those days, they had to be paid. In some places, slaves were also allowed their own small plots of land to grow vegetables or what have you, and they could sell that and make money. With that money, slaves had the rights to purchase their own freedom from their master. They could petition a court to set a price on their head, and then once they had that money saved up, buy their freedom. And masters of slaves were subjected to punishment for violations and abuses of the codes. They could not put slaves to death. Now, these codes weren't perfectly adhered to, but I think the point is they showed that at least in France and in Spain, or in French and Spanish colonies, there's a different understanding of conduct towards slaves. So did it matter? I mean, they weren't always uniformly enforced. There's no record of a slave owner being punished under either one of these codes for violations. It is worth noting that Protestant territories, so English and Dutch predominantly, had no such codes. It was illegal to baptize or marry a slave. Slave families were often separated and sold off individually. Owners, in many cases, in these English and Dutch colonies, were forbidden from freeing their slaves. You could not grant freedom to a slave. And they were allowed to, they could apply unlimited force to compel labor, up to the point of death. So did it matter? Did it make a difference? One of the resources I was looking at, they went back to the US Census of 1830. And they looked at information from southern states, and they looked at the black population in the census of 1830. What they found was, within the black population in Louisiana, which was predominantly French, Spanish controlled, so under those codes, 13.2% of the black population was free, not slaves. But next door neighbors of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi were 1.3, 1.1, and 0.8% of their population was free. And looking at cities, New Orleans, 41.7% of the black population of New Orleans in 1830 were free men. Charleston was the next highest large city in the South in 1830, and 6.4% of black men in Charleston were free. So, was it the codes? Was it not the codes? I think you can make an argument. I mean, granted, correlation isn't causation, but the fact that these were territories that were governed by these codes, and we see that there was at least some impact on freedom for slaves in those areas, even though the church taught against it, and they ignored the church, there was something in that little nagging conscience of theirs that they had to give something to kind of mitigate that. The other thing to look at as far as slavery in the New World is what the Jesuits did in South America. Has anyone seen the movie The Mission? Excellent movie. You have to watch it. It stars Jeremy Irons, Robert De Niro, and it's about this. It's about the Jesuit Republic of Paraguay in 1609. The Jesuits came in, and they established a Jesuit republic, mostly in the jungle of South America. And they worked with the Guarani Indians, and they established 30 what they called reductions, basically communities, self-sustaining agricultural communities. They included, they featured paved streets, large buildings. They built churches, and you can still go down into Paraguay and see the remnants of these buildings today from these communities. They had entire symphony orchestras made up of Guarani natives. And the reason that Jesuits did that is they wanted to, evangelize the population, civilize them so that when Spanish or Portuguese authorities came, they wouldn't have they're just natives look to them. That they could see in the Guarani communities something that reminded them of Europe, with the hopes that that would bridge a gap between the Europeans and the indigenous people, and kind of lessen the idea that we can enslave these people. If we see that they're capable of doing everything that they have in Europe, then maybe we shouldn't be enslaving them. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Spanish and Portuguese still came in. They overran all of the 30 reductions, carried off a lot of Jesuits to prison and put them to death. Spain expelled the Jesuits from all of their Spanish territories. The end of the movie, the mission isn't necessarily a happy ending. It's a really good movie. All right, Galileo. Myths about Galileo: that the church tortured and imprisoned Galileo for his scientific discovery that the earth revolved around the sun. Galileo proves that the church is anti-science, and the true pursuit of scientific knowledge and discovery had to wait until the Enlightenment, when man broke free of religion. The big argument at the time was a geocentric or heliocentric view of the universe. So did the universe revolve around the earth? Did our solar system revolve around the earth, or did it revolve around the sun? Galileo wasn't the first to propose that the earth revolved around the sun. In fact, Nicholas Copernicus did just that several decades before. His work was dedicated to the Pope at the time. Nicholas became a priest. And even Copernicus wasn't the first either. They were just kind of building on individuals before them. Part of the problem with accepting this heliocentric theory really had nothing to do with religion at all. Just from a scientific standpoint, both Copernicus and Galileo had problems with their theories. Most of the scholars of the day, most of the universities were geocentric, that the earth, everything revolved around the earth. Because there are mathematical and observational inconsistencies. So both Copernicus and Galileo, when they came up with their proposals of the sun being the center of the solar system, their problem was they envisioned circular orbits rather than elliptical orbits that we know we have. And so because of the circular orbits, their calculations on where you should find stars and so forth and so on at different points of the year didn't match up. So there was legitimate scientific criticism of Galileo because not all of his theories were bearing out when tried to be proved. Okay, so basically you have to remember that at the time of Galileo, this is post-Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation is going on. The 30 Years' War is going on. So Europe is ripped in half by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, Protestants and Catholics fighting with each other. And at the core of this is the authority of Scripture and theology and church. And that's a big issue. What happened here was the Pope at the time didn't want to squash scientific study, but basically asked that the scientists made their observations and they made that they proposed them as theories. I think this is the way this works, rather than just say, this is it. Because if you're putting out a theory, then it doesn't really drag in theology. Right? If you say, boom, this is the way it is, at the time, like for Galileo, then all these theological questions come into play too. It's interpreting Scripture, and what does this passage mean? How do you relate that to this? Galileo published Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems. And this book of his, there were three characters. One was putting forward the heliocentric, the sun is the center argument. One was putting forth the geocentric argument, earth is the center. And one was kind of a referee. His name was Simplicio, simpleton. And Galileo basically put the Pope's words in the mouth of Simplicio. Well, that was where he got into trouble. Okay. He embarrassed the Pope, and he put forward his ideas not as theory, but as fact, which we can now say he was wrong on. He was summoned to the Roman Inquisition and placed under house arrest. He was never imprisoned. He was placed under house arrest in a mansion with servants He lived out his days there. He was never tortured. He never. He finally recanted. But what's interesting is most of his ideas, most of his theories were actually proven wrong by science as science progressed. He was right that the Earth revolves around the sun, but he insisted the sun was stationary and the sun didn't move. But we know the sun does move. And that's part of why his observations and his mathematics were off. And Galileo himself remained deeply religious and Catholic, even while he was under house arrest. He wasn't like this secular guy, atheist, or something like that. He remained Catholic. That's why he came to the Inquisition. He was offered shelter from having to go before the Inquisition by, I believe it was Venice. And he said, no, I want to go. I want to have this conversation. So is the church anti-science? No. We founded the university and hospital systems. And just to look at some of the scientists that are Catholic. Roger Bacon from the 13th century developed the scientific method. Nicholas Steno in the 14th century was a pioneer in anatomy. There are still parts of our bodies that bear his name because he discovered them. Glands and pituitary tracts and this and that. And in geology, man of all many flavors. He was the first to propose the idea of that fossils came from living things. Until that time, people thought that fossils were just rocks. He was the first to say, no, this used to be a living thing. He didn't have a clear understanding of how, but he's the first person to put forward that idea of fossils. Leonardo da Vinci. He started the scientific revolution of the Middle Ages. Blaise Pascal, 17th century, developed probability theory. He was a philosopher, a scientist, a mathematician. Gregor Mendel was a monk who came up with modern genetics. Louis Pasteur was a devout Catholic. He's the one that discovered microbiology. We still use pasteurization processes. And Georges Lemaitre, 20th century scientist, buddies with Einstein, and he's the one that came up with the Big Bang Theory, and he was a Catholic priest. So the church is not anti-science. And last but not least, Hitler's Pope. So some of the things about Hitler's Pope, Pius XII, he was an anti-Semitic and Nazi sympathizer. That his silence of Pius and the Catholic Church resulted in the deaths of millions of Jews, and the church did nothing to stop the Holocaust. Here's the funny thing is, this is all new. Because if you go back to the time, this is what you find. New York Times headlines, not exactly your Catholic newspaper. October 28, 1939, the Pope condemns dictators, treaty violators, and racism. August 1942, Pope is said to plead for Jews listed for removal from France. August 1942, Vichy seizes Jews, Pope Pius ignored. This is from a December 1941 editorial by the New York Times. The voice of Pius XII is a lonely voice in the silence and darkness enveloping Europe this Christmas. He is about the only ruler left on the continent of Europe who cares to raise his voice at all. The Pope put himself squarely against Hitlerism. He left no doubt that the Nazi claims are also irreconcilable with his own conception of a Christian peace. Not exactly silent, at least not the silent Pope that we think of or we hear about. Jewish voices of the time. Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of Israel. The Holy See is lending its powerful help wherever it can to mitigate the fate of my persecuted co-religionists. He said that in 1943. Moshe Sherratt, who was the first foreign minister of Israel. My first duty was to thank him, and through him, the Catholic Church, for all they had done in various countries to rescue the Jews. And Golda Meir, who was the Israeli prime minister, when our people went through the horrors of martyrdom, the Pope raised his voice to condemn the persecutors. Hitler hated the Catholic Church and Pius XII. Hitler closed all Catholic schools. He arrested and murdered thousands of priests and religious and seminarians in concentration camps. Think of St. Maximilian Kolbe, Blessed Edith Stein as examples. In 1942, the Nazis printed 10 million copies of a pamphlet accusing Pius of being a pro-Jewish pope. And in 1943, Hitler developed a plot to kidnap Pius XII that was only canceled because the Allies took control of Italy. Hitler planned to kidnap, possibly kill Pius XII. Not exactly a sympathizer, at least from Hitler's standpoint. So how do we get this idea that he was Hitler's pope and an anti-Semite? The first evidence is 1944. Izvestia, which was the official party newspaper of the USSR, published a story claiming that Pius XII supported the Nazis. The New York Times promptly came out with a story of their own discrediting that report. And in 1963, a play by Rolf Hochhuth, the deputy, opened in Germany to rave reviews and went on to London and made its way to Broadway and toured all over Europe and North America. In this play, it puts forth the idea, again, that Pius was working with the Nazis and was a sympathizer and anti-Semitic. And from a cultural standpoint, again, it's just started to pick up steam. In 1999, John Cornwell published Hitler's Pope, which is, you could still get on Amazon. Cornwell was a fallen away Catholic, and again made similar arguments that Pope was anti-Semitic and in league with the Nazis. In 2007, the former head of the Romanian Secret Service revealed in a book that he wrote something called Operation Seat, actually it should be 12, Operation Seat 12. It was a KGB covert operation started by the Russians and involving the Romanians to put out a propaganda against the Catholic Church, against the Pope, specifically Pius XII. Operation Seat 12, 12 was for Pius XII. Khrushchev was behind it. He famously said that dead men cannot defend themselves. They started this 2 years after Pius XII died. The goal was to undermine the moral authority of the church because Pius was such an outspoken critic to communism, and they recognized that the church was their largest obstacle to domination. It was the one thing that still gave people hope behind the Iron Curtain. As far as Pius and the Jews, it's estimated between 700 and 860,000 Jews were saved by efforts related to Pius XII and the work of the church under him at that time. They used buildings in the Vatican, numerous churches and convents and monasteries. Castle Gandolfo, which is the Pope's summer residence, were all used to hide Jews and run in almost an underground railroad, if you will, of Jews leaving Europe, fleeing. They could go there, they were provided with shelter and safety, kosher meals were cooked for them. Israel Zoli, who was the rabbi of the synagogue in Rome, became friends with Pius and was so moved by the work that Pius and the church was doing that he actually converted to Catholicism and took Pius's baptismal name of Eugenio as his own when he was baptized in 1944. So why could we say that Pius was quiet? Because there were times where he didn't always preach against the Nazis. Even that New York Times article, the editorial from his Christmas address in 1925, he never used Hitler or Nazis explicitly in that in his address, but it was obvious that if you read it, you knew who he was talking about. Well, some have theorized that there was concern that being too vocal would result in greater persecution. We saw examples of this in Europe under Nazi control, where at different times, for example, the Archbishop of Utrecht in the Netherlands issued a scathing rebuke of the Nazis, and the Nazis responded by a crackdown on Catholic parishes and seminaries and schools. That was where Edith Stein was arrested and shipped off to concentration camp. There was concern that it would draw more attention to Catholic churches and leaders in the Nazi areas. Pius was using churches to smuggle Jews out. The last thing you want to do is draw attention to the churches. To maintain neutrality of Vatican City. We forget Vatican City is a city-state. It is a state. They declared neutrality during World War II, just like Switzerland. So they weren't invaded, attacked, and it provided, again, a safe haven for many Jews. There's also the realization that Hitler was not going to suddenly change his mind because the Pope said, don't do this. So it was kind of weighing the pluses and the minuses, right? If I speak out really strongly, Hitler's still not going to listen to me, but I'm going to cause a lot of attention to come down on the church. There's one more reason. It's from a book called Church of Spies. It came out just a couple of years ago. The last day during the war when Pius publicly said the word Jew is also, in fact, the first day history can document his choice to help kill Hitler. Pius was covertly working with German resistance and Allied leaders. We know now from documents in the Vatican archives that Pius was directly in contact with leaders of German resistance, including military and intelligence officers that were opposed to Hitler, acting as a go-between between the German resistance and the Allied leaders, to trying to build some support between the two and build kind of levels of trust and help coordinate activities. He used specifically Jesuits and Dominicans as spies in Europe. Jesuits and Dominicans don't report to bishops, they report to their congregational leaders. And so there was no concern that, because there were some bishops who were Nazi sympathizers, there were some that were just kind of going along to get along. But Pius knew that if he worked with these orders, they didn't have to give reports to their bishop, they gave reports back to Rome. And so he used Jesuits and Dominicans as a network of spies throughout Nazi-controlled Europe to get information and to funnel information between the Allies and the German resistance. We know that Hitler survived several assassination attempts. There were several occasions where he was supposed to give a speech and they had snipers ready and he canceled at the last minute. Where they had someone with a bomb that was going to stand next to him on the podium. It had a timer on it for 10 minutes, and he finished his speech in 3 and left. There was another bomb that was placed on an airplane with him, but the fuse failed to ignite and the bomb didn't go off. And then finally, there was a bomb that went off at his headquarters in Bavaria, the Wolfslair. He was supposed to have a meeting in a bunker. The bomb was in a suitcase, and it was going to be placed right next to Hitler. At the last minute, he changed the location from the bunker to a cabin. The suitcase was placed in the cabin. It went off. The bomb went off. It was under a large oak table, and because it was in a cabin rather than a bunker, a concrete bunker would have contained the blast. It was a log cabin that blew the wall out and dissipated the force, so Hitler survived. Hitler, on the flip side of this, all his failed assassination attempts convinced them he was invincible. All right, well, let's go with this. I'll show you again. The final point on there was that finally, towards the end of the war, the resistance was found out. They were discovered by German intelligence. Many were rounded up, executed in the final days of the war. But it was starting around 1943, 44. Some started getting picked up, and the Vatican found out that they basically had been found out, and began working with forces in Italy to help stage the coup that overthrew Mussolini, which gave them some safety as well. There we go. Okay. So what do we take away from all this tonight? Is that A, has the Catholic Church always perfectly lived out the faith? No. The church is a perfect institution. We believe in one holy Catholic Church, right? We believe the church is holy as an institution. Unfortunately, it's made up with imperfect people. Many myths have elements of truth, but were exaggerated or fabricated by enemies of the faith. If you read, some of the materials and some of the books that are out there that kind of break these things down, almost universally, everything gets blown out of proportion either by anti-Catholic, anti-religious writers and philosophers. Sometimes it's the same names coming up over and over again. Or in the instance of like Pius XII, actual government propaganda from the communists trying to undermine him. But those things, they take root because they're just people that are willing to believe the worst about religious people, about any church, about Catholicism in general. And while it's good to know the whole truth, we shouldn't shy away from apologizing if we need to. In all of these cases, could more have been done? Could we have been better? Yes. So there's always room for apology. And I know John Paul II has done it, Francis has done it, issued statements apologizing for the shortcomings of the church over the years. If that's what it'll take to break someone's resistance down, then it's worth swallowing pride and doing that. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned back to the Crusades that Muslims had, taken most of Spain. When was that taken back, or maybe which crusade, or what time?
It was.
Repeat the question.
When were the Muslims basically forced out of Spain? They didn't. For starters, they didn't all leave. You still see their influence. In fact, Fatima in Portugal, Fatima was one of Muhammad's daughters. That's where that name comes from. But it was over a period of a couple hundred years where they were finally, the Moors were finally driven out of Spain, but many Muslims still stayed behind. And that's where you got into the Inquisition. You had these Muslims that were basically left behind after Catholic kings had come and taken over. They were still living there in relative peace until the various little uprisings or riots started and that sort of thing.
So it really wasn't part of any particular crusade?
No.
Okay.
Is it not also true that following the Jewish rebellions shortly after Christ's death, that the Romans basically evicted the Jews from the Holy Land?
Yes.
So that when the Muslims took over, they were conquering land and tribes that were tribes from Abraham that were not Jewish or other tribes that existed.
Yeah. So following the Jewish revolt in mid first century up to 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, after that revolt, the Romans pretty much dispersed the Jews out of the Holy Land, leaving behind Christians, but many of them had already fled ahead of the Romans. And so yeah, so you basically had a vacuum where it was easy for it would eventually become Muslims to come in. You had nomadic groups of people that were living in the Holy Land. Some Jews came back in the time after that, but you still had, that was 70 AD. Islam didn't come along until 600 AD. So you had, in that time period, the Holy Land was pretty much rebuilt up by Catholics and Christians. We see it's particularly like Constantine, his mother, St. Helena, came back, and that's where a lot of the relics were found, and churches were built and things like that. So it was by the time the Muslims came through, it was a predominantly Christian area.
Otherwise, that was Battle of George Martel, 1732, 732. He defeated the Moors, and a lot of them left France after that, I mean Spain.
Okay. That was under the Franks.
That was right.
Yeah. All right. Next month. Secrets, Visions, and Miracles, the True Story of Fatima. April 25th here at 7 o'clock. This year is the 100th anniversary of Fatima. So this will be April 25th, a couple weeks ahead before that anniversary of the first apparition. We'll kind of go into the whole story of Fatima, some things that a lot of people don't know, visions of the apparitions of the angels that took place before Mary came, and what the messages were, and what happened with the different children, the visionaries, that sort of thing. We'll kind of get into all of that and look at Fatima and its legacy next month.
Thank you.